Alright, so we're going to begin our next learning goal. Today students will be able to describe patterns using decimal numbers. Before we start that, we're going to start with some terminology that I need for you to understand. Um, the first is a sequence, and when we talk about a sequence, we're talking about an ordered list of numbers. So it's a list of numbers that either increase or decrease by a certain pattern, and we're going to try to figure out what that pattern is. The second word or term you need to know is term. And basically a term is the specific number in the sequence. So each number is a term. And the third term that you need to know is interval. And the interval is the value that's between each term in the sequence. So if it increases by 1, then the interval would be 1. If it increases by 2, then the interval would be 2. So whatever that space is in between the terms is the interval. And so when the interval repeats itself, we can determine what that pattern is within the sequence. So let's go ahead and do a sample problem. In this sample problem, we have 4 numbers, and we're going to try to determine what is the interval or the rule in the following sequence. Okay, so I've gone ahead and copied down the sequence that was given us. It has 4 terms in it, so this is a term, this is a term, this is a term, and this is a term. And we want to find the space between each term, which is the interval. So you can do that in a couple different ways. One way, sometimes when the interval is very easy to see, you don't have to do any work. You can just look at it. If it increases by 1, then you know that it's 1. If it increases by 2, you know that it's 2. With decimal numbers, it can be a little bit more complicated, and so the way that we can figure it out is we can do the space in between the two numbers by subtracting. So if I want to find out what the interval is between these two numbers, I'm going to take the 6.75 and I'm going to subtract the 5.00. And again, when we do this, we're always going to take the larger number and subtract the smaller number. So 5 minus 0 is 5, 7 minus 0 is 7. Remember to put the decimal point there, and then 6 minus 5 is 1. So the space between these is 1.75. We can look at the next one to see what the next interval is. And so we take the 8.50 and subtract the 6.75. Here we need to borrow, so that becomes a 4, and this is a 10. So 10 minus 5 is 5. We need to borrow again, so that becomes a 7, and this becomes a 14. 14 minus 7 is 7, and 7 minus 6 is 1. So again, we're starting to see a pattern here. The first interval was 1.75. The second interval was 1.75. Let's check and see for the third one. So we take 10.25 and we subtract 8.50. 5 minus 0 is 5. We need to borrow. We can't borrow from the 0, so we're going to make that a 0. This becomes a 10. Then we borrow from the 10 and it becomes a 9. And the 2 becomes a 12. 12 minus 5 is 7. 9 minus 2 is 1, and we got to remember to bring down our decimal point for our answer. So again, we see that the interval for each of these is 1.75. Now what we have to ask ourselves is, do these numbers increase or decrease by 1.75? Okay, and so we know that 5 going up to 6 are increasing, and so we're going to say that our rule or our interval is adding 1.75. And so we'll check our answer, and the answer is adding 1.75 is the interval or the rule for this particular sequence. Let's do another sample problem. In this particular sample problem, we're going to be looking at a list of numbers, and we need to identify what those unknown terms are. So we're going to identify what the interval is, and then once we find out what the interval is, then we can determine what the unknown terms are. So here we are. We have our sample problem here. We have these values that are our terms. We need to determine what the interval is, so let's do the interval for the first one. Again, we're going to subtract in order to find out what that space is, so we're going to do 29.6 and subtract 28.3. And 6 minus 3 is 3. Bring down our decimal point. 9 minus 8 is 1. 2 minus 2 is 0. And so we have a space there of 1.3. Let's check our second one. And we have 28.3. And we're going to subtract 27. Since we have a space here, we're going to put that placeholder 0 in its place so we don't forget about it. Now we have 3 minus 0 is 3, and 8 minus 7 is 1. Bring down our decimal point, and then 2 minus 2 is 0. So we see that we're looking like we have a pattern here of 1.3. We don't have to do every one. Once we feel like we know what the pattern is, then we can stop. If we want to fill in the blank here, so if we look at our first interval, 1.3, it's going from 29 to 28, so that means it's getting smaller, and so our interval is going to be a negative 1.3. So when we're trying to find our unknown value, we're going to subtract 1.3 from this value. So we're going to have 25.7, and we're going to subtract 1.3. 7 minus 3 is 4, 5 minus 1 is 4, 2 minus 0 is 2, put the decimal point. So this value is going to be 24.4, so we can write that in here. Now that we know what this one is, we can find this next unknown term. Again, we're going to subtract 1.3. 4 minus 3 is 1, 4 minus 1 is 3, and 2 minus 0 is 2. Bring down our decimal point, and so this value is going to be 23.1. And then we have one more unknown term, so we're going to subtract another 1.3. On this one we have to borrow, so that 3 becomes a 2, the 1 becomes an 11. 11 minus 3 is 8. 2 minus 1 is 1, and 2 minus 0 is 2 when we put our decimal point. So our last term is going to be 21.8. We can check to see if that's working, so by taking our 21.8 and subtracting 20.5, 8 minus 5 is 3, 1 minus 0 is 1, 2 minus 2 is 0. We put it, and again we see that when we subtract we get that interval of 1.3 again, so we know that we've gone ahead and continued our sequence. Okay, so let's go ahead and check our answers. And we see they are 24.4, 23.1, and 21.8 are the unknown values. Alright, so have some practice problems here for you. For number 1, you just have to find the interval. So you're just going to be subtracting to find the interval. For numbers 2 and 3, you have to find the interval and the unknown term. Okay, so you have two things that you have to find for 2 and 3. Go ahead and pause the video, work out these practice problems, and then once you think you have your answers, restart the video and check your answers. Alright, so go ahead and check your answers. Number one, there was an interval of adding 1.3. For number two, the interval was subtracting 6.3, and the unknown term was 12.6. And for number three, we were adding 1.2, and the unknown term was 2.7. So check your work. If you have any questions, bring them to class tomorrow, and you have a great rest of your evening.